Hi guys, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, like it is every week, and I'm really excited to get into today's story. Before I do that, I wanted to say thank you so much for the amazing response I got to my question, what makes a good princess? Because I think when we read stories like this, they bring up important questions that we need to look inside of ourselves and figure out how we think about the questions that are brought up, if that makes any sense. So basically, the morals that are in each story are incredibly important. And besides being spoken out loud, you really have to think about them critically to see if they actually speak to you and mean something to you. Because otherwise, if someone's just spouting words at you, it's not really going to do anything. But when you actually take the time to listen and comprehend and do some inward searching, that's when they do the most. So it's a little bit of doing your own personal work. And I'm really proud of you guys for actually thinking deep inside of yourself and thinking, what makes a good princess? So thanks. It was also fun for me too. Now today, the story that we have for you is very interesting. I am really excited for it because it's one that I've been saving for later because it's a little bit longer, and I mean pretty long, so this is probably going to be a part 1 and part 2, but it's very involved, and I'm just excited to share it with you guys. So, the story we are going to read today is The Marsh King's Daughter, part 1. So, storks tell their children of many tales, all of them about the swamp and the bog. They're usually tailored to suit the age and level of understanding. The youngest children are amused if someone says, "Tickle, prickle, grumble, mumble." For them, that's fine, but the older ones want a deeper meaning, or at least something about their own family. Of the 2 oldest and longest tales that have been passed down by the storks, we know one of them. The one about Moses, who was set in the waters of the Nile by his mother. He was found by a king's daughter who was brought up well, and became a great man. But afterwards, no one knew where he was buried. That one is really quite well known. The other tale is still little known, maybe because they've kept it to themselves in Denmark. This tale has passed from stork mother to stork mother for more than 1,000 years. And each of them has told it better and better, but now we will tell it the best of all. The first stork couple who told the story and actually took part in it had their summer residence on top of a Viking's timbered house up near Wildbog in Vendsyssel. That's in Hjørring County, far to the north up towards Skagen and Jutland. If we were going to be precise about it, it's still an enormously large bog that you can read about it in the official description of the country. It was once the ocean floor, but it rose up, as the book says. It stretches for miles, surrounded on all sides by wet meadows and shifting marshlands, with peat bogs, cloudberries, and scraggly trees. Fog is almost always hovering above it, and 70 years ago there were still wolves. It can be truly called a wild bog, and you can imagine what a wilderness it was, how many swamps and lakes there were 1,000 years ago. Well, back then the details were the same as you see now. The reeds were the same height, with the same kind of long leaves and violet-brown feathery flowers that they now bear. The birches stood there with their white bark and delicate drooping leaves, just as they do today. And as far as the living creatures that came here, well, the fly wore its gauzy garments, the same style as now. The stork's natural color was white, with black and red stockings. At that time, humans, on the other hand, wore a different style of dress than today. But to all of them, whether thrall or hunter, to anyone who stepped into the quagmire, the same thing happened. 1,000 years ago that still happens today to those who come here. They fell and sank down to the Marsh King, as they called him, who ruled the great bog kingdom. He could also be called the Quagmire King, but we prefer to say Marsh King, and the storks called him that too. Very little is known about his rule, but maybe that's for the best. Close to the bog, right near Limfjord, stood the Viking's timbered house with a stone-lined cellar, a tower, and 3 floors. High atop the roof, the stork had built his nest. Mother sat on the eggs, certain that they would turn out just fine. One evening, Stork Father was gone a rather long time, and when he returned home he looked rumpled and harried. "I have something quite dreadful to tell you," he said to the Stork Mother. "Don't tell me," she said. "Keep in mind that I'm sitting on eggs. You might upset me, and that might affect the eggs." "I have to tell you," he said. "She came here, the daughter of our landlord in Egypt. She dared to make the journey up here, and now she's disappeared." "The one who's kin to the fairies? Oh, tell me. You know I can't stand it when I'm sitting on these eggs." "Well, you see, Mother, she believed what the doctor said, just like you told me. She believed that the white water lily up here could help her sick father, and she took to the air wearing a skin of feathers with 2 other feathered-clad princesses who came north every year to bathe to be rejuvenated. She came, and now she's disappeared." "You're being so long-winded," said the Stork Mother. "The eggs might catch cold. I can't stand to be kept in suspense." "I've been keeping an eye out," said Stork Father. "And this evening I was walking among the reeds where the quagmire can bear my weight, where 3 swans appeared. There was something about the way they moved that said to me, 'Watch out! They're not all swan. They're just swan skins.' You know the feeling, Mother. You know as I do what the real thing is." "Of course," she said. "But tell me about the princess. I'm bored hearing about swan skins." "In the middle of the bog, as you know, there's a kind of lake," said the Stork Father. "You can see a bit of it if you raise yourself up. Over there near the reeds and the green quagmire lay a big alder log. That's where the 3 swans landed, flapping their wings and looking all around. One of them threw off her swan skin, and I recognized her, our princess from home in Egypt. She sat there wearing no cloak other than her long black hair. I heard her ask the 2 others to take good care of her swanskin while she dove underwater to pick the flower she thought she could see. They nodded and took flight, lifting up the limp feather gown. I wonder what they're going to do with it, I thought. And apparently she asked them the same question, and their answers she could see for herself. They flew off with her swanskin. 'Go ahead and dive down,' they shouted. 'Never again will you fly wearing a swanskin. Never again will you see the land of Egypt. Stay here in the wild bog.' And they tore her feather skin to 100 pieces so the feathers flew all around like a snowstorm, and off they flew, those 2 wretched princesses." "That's horrible," said the Stork Mother. "I can't stand to hear about this. So tell me what happened next." "The princess wailed and wept. Tears rolled down to the alder log, and then it started to move, because it was the Marsh King himself, the one who lives in the bog. I saw the log turn over, and then it was no longer a log. Long, mud-covered branches were sticking up like arms. Then the poor child grew frightened and ran off into the shifting quagmire. But at that spot it can't even bear my weight, let alone hers. She sank at once, and the alder log went down with her. He was the one who dragged her in. Big black bubbles rose up, and then there was not a trace that remained. Now she's buried in Wild Bog. She will never take the flowers to the land of Egypt. You would not have been able to stand there watching it, Mother." "You shouldn't tell me things like that right now. It might affect the eggs. I'm sure the princess can take care of herself. She's bound to get help. If it had been you or me, or one of ours, it would have been all over. Still, I'm going to take a look every day," said the Stork Father. And he did. A long time passed. Then one day, he saw that from the deep down on the bottom of a green stalk was shooting up, and when it reached the surface of the water, a leaf grew out of it, getting wider and wider. Not long after, a bud appeared, and early one morning when the stork flew over it, a strong sunlight made the flower bud open. In the middle lay a lovely child, a little girl, as if she had just stepped out of the bath. She looked so much like the princess from Egypt that at first the stork thought it was her, grown small. But after he thought about things, it seemed more reasonable that she was a child of the princess and the Marsh King. That's why she was laying inside a water lily. "But she can't stay here," thought the stork, "and it's already so crowded in my nest. But I have an idea. The Viking woman has no children, though she has often wished for one, and I'm always blamed for bringing babies, so for once I'm going to prove them right. I'll fly to the Viking woman with the child. What joy there will be!" and the stork picked up the little girl, flew over to the timbered house, and with his beak pecked a hole in the window pane made from a pig's bladder. He placed the child in the arms of the Viking woman, then flew back to Stork Mother and told her all about it while the youngsters listened. They were old enough to understand. "You see, the princess isn't dead. She sent her child up here, and now I've found a place for her." "That's what I've said all along," said the Stork Mother. "Pay little attention to your own children now. It will soon be traveling time. I'm starting to feel a tickle under my wings. The cuckoo and the nightingale have already left, and I've heard the quails saying that we'll soon have good tailwinds. Our youngsters will know how to do us proud on the maneuvers, if I know them right." Oh, how happy the Viking woman was when she woke in the morning to find a lovely child in her arms. She kissed and caressed her, but the child screamed terribly, flailing her arms and legs. She didn't seem the least bit pleased. Finally, she cried herself to sleep, and as the child lay there like that, she was one of the loveliest creatures ever seen. The Viking woman was so happy, so light in body and soul. She now had a feeling that her husband and all his men might arrive just as unexpectedly as the little girl had, so she and the entire household set to work putting everything in order. The long, colorful tapestries that she and the maids had woven with images of their gods, Odin, Thor, and Freya, as they were called, were hung on the walls. The thralls polished and old shields that were on display, cushions were placed on the benches, and dry firewood was put on the hearth in the middle of the hall, so the fire could be lit at once. The Viking woman joined in the work, and by evening she was very tired and slept well. But when she awoke toward the morning, she was terribly frightened, because the little child had vanished. She sat up, lit a pine splinter, and looked all around, and at the spot where she had stretched out her feet in bed lay not the little child, but a big, hideous frog. She was quite disgusted by it, picked up a heavy stick, and would have killed the frog, but it looked at her with such strange, sad eyes that she couldn't strike it. Once again, she looked all around. The frog uttered a faint, pitiful croak. She gave a start and sprang out of bed over to the shuttered window, which she threw open. At that very moment the sun appeared, casting its rays on the bed and the big frog. Suddenly, the beast's wide lips seemed to shrink and became little and pink. Its limbs stretched out to become the most charming figure. It was her own lovely little child laying there, and not the hideous frog. "What's this?" she said. "Was I having a bad dream? It's my own enchanting fairy child lying there." And she kissed the girl and pressed her to her heart. But the child scratched and bit as if she were a wild kitten. Not that day nor the next day did the Viking lord arrive. He was on his way, but the wind was against him. It was blowing south for the storks, tailwind for one and headwind for the other. In a couple of days and nights, it became clear to the Viking woman that what was wrong with her little child. A terrible spell had been cast over her. By the day she was lovely as a sylph, but she had a mean and wild nature. At night, on the other hand, she was a hideous frog, quietly whimpering with sorrowful eyes. The two temperaments had switched back and forth, both outwardly and inwardly. This was because the little girl who had been brought by the stork possessed in the daytime her real mother's looks, but had her father's disposition. At night, on the other hand, her kinship to him became visible in the shape of her body, while from inside she radiated her mother's character and heart. Who could break from the powerful power of this black magic? It caused this Viking woman both alarm and sorrow, yet her heart clung to the poor creature, whose condition she didn't dare mention to her husband when he returned home. Then he would certainly put the poor child out on the road, as was custom, and anyone who wished could take her. The gentle Viking woman didn't have the heart to do that. He would only be allowed to see the child in the light of day. Early one morning, there was the rush of stork wings above the roof. That's where more than 100 stork pairs had rested during the night after their great maneuvers. Now they were taking head and flying to the south. "Every man ready!" came the order. "Women and children, too!" "We feel so light," said the stork fledglings. "It's tickling and prickling all the way to our feet, as if we were filled with live frogs. How lovely it is to be traveling abroad." "Stay with the flock," said father and mother, "and stop clacking your beaks so much. It's not good for your lungs." And off they flew. At the same moment, the lure horn sounded over the heath. The Viking had landed with all his men. They were returning home with rich bounty from the Gallic coast, where people in terror sang as they had in Bretland. "Free us all from the wild Norsemen!" Oh, what fun and merriment there was in the Viking stronghold near the wild bog. The mead cask was brought into the hall, the fire was lit, and horses were slaughtered. A proper feast was being prepared. The fire cracked, and smoke drifted along the ceiling, and soot dripped from the timbers. But they were used to it. Guests were invited, and they were given fine gifts. Forgotten were schemes and falsehoods. They drank and drank, tossing gnawed bones at each other's face. That was a sign of good humor. The skald, he was a kind of musician, but also a warrior, and since he had been with them, he knew what he was singing about, presented them with a ballad that recounted all their war exploits and deeds. Every verse was followed by the same refrain: "Fortunes die, kinsmen die, every man must die, but never will die a glorious name." And then they all struck their shields and pounded on the table with their knives or a bone, making tremendous noise. The Viking woman sat on the cross bench in the vast banquet hall. She was wearing a silk gown, gold bracelets, and big amber beads. She had on all her finery. The skald mentioned her too in his song, speaking of the golden treasures that she had brought her rich husband, and he was truly pleased with the lovely child. He had seen her only in the daytime in all her loveliness. He approved of the wild nature she possessed, and he said she could become a formidable warrior maiden who would slay her foe. She wouldn't blink an eye if a practiced hand, in jest, would slice off her eyebrow with a sharp sword. The mead cask was emptied, and a new one was brought up. Yes, drink there was in abundance. These were men who could hold a great deal. Back then, there was a proverb: "Cattle know when to start home from grazing, but unwise men never know the measure of their bellies." Well, they knew, of course, but it's one thing to know and another to act. They also knew that love turns to hate if he stays too long in another man's house. Yet there they stayed. Meat and mead are good things. They had a merry time, and at night the thralls slept in the warm ashes, dripping their fingers in the greasy soot and licking them. What a splendid time! Once again, that year of the Vikings set off on a raid, paying no heed to the autumn storms that were brewing. With his men, he headed off the coast of Bretland. It was, after all, just across the water, as he said. His wife stayed behind with the little girl, and it's true that the foster mother soon grew more fond of the poor frog with the pious eyes and the deep sighs than of the lovely girl who bit and scratched everyone. The raw, wet autumn fog, called mouthless, which gnaws off the leaves, hovered over forest and heath. Featherless bird, as they called the snowflakes, flew thick and fast. Winter was on its way. The sparrows took over the stork's nest, arguing in their own fashion about the absent master and mistress, and the stork couple with their youngsters. Where were they now? The storks were in the land of Egypt, where the warm sun shone as it does for us on a lovely summer day. The tamarinds and acacias were blooming all around. Muhammad's crescent was shining brightly from the domes of the mosques. Many a stork pair sat on the slender towers resting after a long journey. Great flocks had nest after nest atop the mighty pillars and crumbled arches of temples and abandoned sites. The date palm lifted its canopy high overhead as if it wanted to be a parasol. The grayish-white pyramids stood like silhouettes against the clear air of the desert, where the ostrich showed how it could use its legs, and the lion sat with great wise eyes, gazing at the marble sphinx that lay half buried in the sand. The waters of the Nile had retreated. The whole riverbed was swarming with frogs, and for the stork family that was the loveliest sight in the land. The children thought they were seeing things, so marvelous did they find it all. "That's how things are here. That's how they always are for us in our warm country," said the stork mother, and the youngsters felt a tickling in their bellies. "Is there more for us to see?" they said. "Are we going much further into the country?" "There's nothing more to see," said the stork mother. "In the lush region there's nothing but wild forest where the trees grow close together, tangled up with spiny, twining plants. Only the elephant with its plump legs can make a path. The snakes are too big for us, and the lizards too quick. If you go out to the desert, you get sand in your eyes, if the weather is fine, and if not, you'll end up in a dust devil. No, this place is best. This is where the frogs and grasshoppers are. This is where I'm staying, and so are you." And stay they did. The older storks sat in their nests on the slender minarets, resting, and yet busy smoothing out their feathers and rubbing their beaks on the red stockings. Then they would stretch out their necks, nod gravely, and raise their heads with big, high foreheads and elegant, smooth feathers, their bright eyes shining so wisely. The girl fledglings walked gravely around amongst lush reeds, stealing glances at the other stork youngsters and making friends. Every third step they would swallow a frog, or they would walk around dangling a little snake. They thought it made them look quite nice, and it tasted good too. The boy fledglings quarreled, flapping their wings at each other, pecking with their beaks, yes, even drawing blood. And then one after the other they got engaged. Boy fledglings and girl fledglings, that was what they lived for after all. And they built nests and then started quarreling all over again, because in the hot countries everyone has a temper. Yet it was pleasant, and a particularly great joy for the old storks. Their children could do no wrong. Every day the sun shone, every day was filled with eating, their only thoughts were for pleasure. But inside the lavish palace of their Egyptian landlord, as they called him, there was no pleasure to be found. The rich mighty lord lay on a divan, all his limbs rigid, stretched out like a mummy in the middle of the great hall with the colorfully painted walls. It was as if he were lying inside a tulip. Kingsmen and servants stood around him. He wasn't dead, but neither could he be called properly alive. The healing white water lily from the northern countries, the one that was going to be found and plucked by the person who loved him most, would never arrive. His lovely young daughter, who was wearing a swan skin, had flown over sea and far to the north, would never come back. "She's dead and gone," said the two swan maidens, which is what they reported when they returned. Together they'd made a whole story about it, and here's what they said. "All three of us were flying high in the air when a hunter saw us and fired his arrow. It struck our young friend, and slowly singing her farewell, she sank like a dying swan into the middle of the forest lake. There on the shore beneath a fragrant weeping birch, we buried her. Yet we took our revenge. We tied a torch beneath the wings of a swallow who was nesting under the hunter's hatched roof. The eaves caught fire. The house went up in flames, and he was burned to death inside. The glow reached across the lake to the drooping birch where she is now, earth in the earth. She will never return to the land of Egypt." And they both wept. And Stork Father, when he heard about it, clacked his beak so hard it rattled. "Lies and deception," he said. "I have an urge to jab my beak right through them." "And snap it off," said the Stork Mother. "Then you'd certainly look good. Think first about yourself and about your family. Nothing else matters." "Well, I'm still going to perch on the rim of the open dome tomorrow. When all the learned and wise men gather to talk about the sick men, maybe they'll get a little closer to the truth." And the learned and wise men gathered and talked a great deal and at length, but the stork could make no sense of it. The ill man had no benefit from it either, nor did his daughter in the wild bog. Yet, we might as well listen in for a while. People have to listen to so much. But it would be best to hear and know what came before, so we can better follow the story, at least as well as the Stork Father did. Love nourishes life. The greatest love nourishes the greatest life. Only through love can he win the salvation of life. This is what was said, and it was exceptionally wise and well put, claimed the learned men. "What an enchanting idea," said the Stork Father. "I don't really understand it," said the Stork Mother. "And it's not my fault, it's the idea's fault. But that doesn't matter. I have other things to think about." Then the learned men had talked about love between this and that, the difference that existed between the love that sweethearts have and the love between parents and children, between the light and the plants, the way the rays of sun kissed the marsh and the sprout that resulted. It was all presented in such long-winded and learned fashion that it was impossible for the Stork Father to follow. never mind repeat. He grew quite thoughtful and closed his eyes halfway, and stood on one leg the whole next day. Learning was so hard for him to bear. Yet this much Storkfather understood. He had heard both the common folk and the highest nobles say from their hearts that it was great misfortune for many thousands, and for the country itself, that the man lay ill and could not get well. What a joy and a blessing it would be if he regained his health. "But where does the flower grow that can give him health?" they asked everyone. Searched the learned writings, searched the gleaming stars, searched the weather and wind, searched all along the pathways they could find, and finally the learned and the wise, as were mentioned, decided this. Love nourishes life, life for the Father. And in this way they said more than they knew. They repeated it and wrote it down as a precept. Love nourishes life. But as to how everything might follow this precept, well, they didn't get any farther. At least they agreed that help must come from the princess, who, with all her soul and heart, loved her father. They finally also decided how this might be done. Yes, it was more than a year and a day that she was sent out at night, just as the bright new moon was set once more. She headed for the marble sphinx in the desert, tossed aside the sand and the base of the door, and then walked through the long passageway that led into the center of the great pyramids. There, one of the mighty ancient kings lay in his mummy case, surrounded by splendor and glory. There she was to lower her head to the dead, and then it would be revealed to her how to win life and salvation for her father. All that she had done, and in her dreams she learned that from the deep bog in the land of Denmark, the place that was described in great detail, she would bring home the lotus blossom that touched her breast in the waters deep. Then he would be saved. And that's why she flew in a swan's skin from the land of Egypt up to Wild Bog. See, Stork mother and father knew all this, and now we understand it more clearly than we did before. We know that the Marsh King pulled her down. We know that for those back home she was dead and gone. Only the wisest among them continued to say, as Stork mother did, "She'll take care of herself." And that's what they were counting on, because they couldn't think of anything better. "I think I'm going to steal the swan skins from those two wretched princesses," said the Stork father. "Then they won't be able to go to the Wild Bog and do any more harm. I'll hide the swan skins up there until they're needed." "Where are you going to hide them up there?" said the Stork mother. "In our nest at the Wild Bog," he said. "Our youngest fledglings and I can help each other carry them, and if they get too heavy for us, then there are places along the way to hide them until the next migration. I suppose one swan skin would be enough for her, but two would be better. It's always good to have a lot of traveling clothes in the northern country." "Nobody's going to thank you for this," said the Stork mother. "But you're the boss. I have nothing to say except during brooding season." The Viking stronghold at Wild Bog is where the storks flew in the spring, and the little girl had been given a name. They called her Helga. But that name was much too gentle for the kind of temperament possessed by the loveliest of all creatures. Month by month, this became more apparent. Over the years, as the storks made the same journey in the autumn to the Nile and in the spring to the Wild Bog, the child grew up. And before anyone had time to think about it, she had become the loveliest maiden in her 16th year. Lovely on the outside, but harsh and rough at the core, wilder than most in dark times. She found it amusing to splash her white hands with the streaming blood of the horses as offerings. She savagely bit in half the neck of a black rooster that the priest was about to sacrifice, and to her foster father, she said in all seriousness, "If your enemy came and threw a rope around the timber heads of the roof, if it flew off to your bedchamber while you slept, I wouldn't wake you even if I could. I wouldn't be able to hear it, so loud does the blood still buzz in the ear that you once boxed years ago. I haven't forgotten." But the Viking didn't believe what she said. Like the others, he was deceived by her loveliness. Nor did he know how spirit and hide could change in little Helga. Without a saddle, she would ride her horse off, as if one with it, racing off at full gallop, and she refused to jump off it, began fighting with other mean-spirited steeds. Well, wearing all her clothes, she would often fling herself from the slope onto strong current of fjord, and swim out to meet the Viking when his boat was headed for land. She cut the longest lock from her lovely long hair and plaited it into a string for her bow. "Self-made is well-made," she said. As was the custom of the time, the Viking woman was strong in will and temper, but toward her daughter she seemed gentle and fearful, because she knew, after all, that a spell had been cast over the terrible child. Whenever her mother stood on the gallery or stepped into the courtyard, Helga, seemingly out of spiteful pleasure, all too often would climb onto the edge of the well, throw her arms and legs over, and then plummet into the narrow, deep hole. Frog that she was, she would dive down and then resurface, then crawl up like a cat and come back to the great hall, soaking wet, making the green leaves spread on the floor swirl around in the wet stream. Yet there was one bond that held little Helga, and that was the twilight. Then she would grow quiet, almost pensive, allowing herself to be called and led. Then some sort of inner sense would draw her to her mother. When the sun set and the transformation took place, both inside and out, she would sit there, quiet, sorrowful, shriveled up in the shape of her frog, her body hardly bigger than such an animal's, and for that very reason all the more hideous. She looked like a pitiful dwarf with a frog's head and a webbing between her fingers. There was something so sad about the look in her eyes. She had no voice, only a hollow croak, just like a child who sobs in her dreams. Then the Viking woman would lift Helga onto her lap. She forgot about her horrid shape, seeing only the sad eyes, and said more than once, "I always wish that you were always my mute frog child. You're more terrible to look at when the loveliness is on the outside." And she drew runes against sorcery and sickness, casting them over the miserable child. There was no improvement. "You'd never think she was once so small that she could lie inside a water lily," said the stork father. "Now she's all grown up, and the spitting image of her Egyptian mother, whom we've never seen again. She didn't take care of herself, like you and the learned men thought. Year in and year out I've flown back and forth over the wild bog, but she hasn't given any sign. Yes, I may as well tell you that during all these years when I've come up here ahead of you so I could prepare the nest and get things ready, I spent whole nights flying steadily across open water like an owl or a bat, but it did no good. Nor have we any use for the 2 swan skins that the children and I dragged up here from the land of the Nile. And it wasn't easy. It took us 3 trips to carry them. Now they've lain for many years in the bottom of the nest, and if fire ever broke out here and the timbered house burned down, they'd all be gone." "And our good nest would be gone too," said Stork Mother. "You think less about that than those feather robes and your bog princess. Maybe you should go down there and stay with her in the marsh. You're a bad father to your own children, and that's what I've said ever since I sat on my first egg. I only hope that we and the children won't take an arrow in the wing from that crazy Viking girl. She has no idea what she's doing, and we've been here a little longer than she has, after all. She should bear that in mind. We never forget our obligations, and we pay our rent every year, a feather, an egg, and a fledgling, as is proper. When she's outdoors, do you think I feel like going down there the way I did in the past and the way I do in Egypt? There, I'm practically friends with everyone without forgetting my place, and I could peek into vessels and pots. No, I sit up here annoyed with her, that girl, and I'm annoyed with you too. You should have left her in the water lily, and then she would be gone." "You're much more respectful than your words," said the stork father. "I know you better than you know yourself." And then he leaped up, twice flapped his wings, stretched out his legs behind, and flew off, sailing without moving. He was a good distance away when he took another powerful stroke. The sun shone on his white feathers, his neck and his head stretched out in front. He flew with speed and style. "He's still the handsomest of them all," said Stork Mother. "But I'm not going to tell him that." In early autumn, the Viking came home with plunder and prisoners. Among them was a young Christian priest, one of his men who persecuted the gods of the Nordic countries. Recently, there had been much talk in the hall of the women's house about the new faith that was spreading widely across the lands of the south. Yes, the holy Ensar had even reached as far as Hedeby on the Sklei. Even little Helga had heard about the faith and the white Christ, who, out of love of human beings, had given his life to save them. For her it went in one year and out the other, they say. The word love seemed to mean something different to her only when she was huddled inside a pitiful frog shape in the locked chamber. But the Viking woman had listened and felt strangely gripped by the legends and sagas told about the one true God. When the men returned home from the raid, they told stories of the magnificent temples and precious hewn stones that had been built for the one whose message was love. A pair of heavy golden vessels, artfully carved, made entirely of pure gold, had been carried home. Both of them had an odd spicy scent. They were incense vessels that the Christian priests swung in front of the altar where the blood never flowed. But wine and the consecrated bread came from the blood of the one who had given his life for the generations not yet born. The captured young Christian priest was taken to the depths of the stone-lined cellar of the timbered house. Ropes of bast were tied around his feet and hands. Lovely he was, like Balder to look at. And the Viking woman's, and she said she was touched by his suffering. But young Helga suggested that a rope be looped behind his knees and tied to the tails of wild oxen. Then we'll let the dogs loose. Ooh, across the bogs and watery meadows, off to the heath. That will be a merry sight, even merrier to follow along after him. Yet that was not the death the Viking intended him to suffer. Instead, as one who had denied and persecuted the high gods, he was to be killed the following morning on a sacrificial stone in the grove. It would be the first time that a human being was sacrificed there. Young Helga begged to be allowed to splash in his blood on the idols and the people. She sharpened her gleaming knife. When one of the big fierce dogs, of which there were plenty on the estate, ran across her feet and stuck the knife into his side. That was just to try it out, she said. The Viking woman looked sadly at the wild, mean-spirited girl, and when night came, the shape of the beauty in her daughter's body and soul changed places. She spoke to her warm words of sadness from a sorrowful soul. The ugly frog, with the monstrous body, stood in front of her, fixing those sorrowful brown eyes on her, listening and seeming to understand human words. Never even to my husband has it even crossed my lips how doubly I suffer over you, said the Viking woman. There is more pain in my heart over you than even I could imagine. Great is a mother's love. But never has love appeared in your spirit. Your heart is like a cold lump of marsh clay. How did you ever end up in my house? Then the pitiful creature began trembling strangely, as if the words had touched an invisible bond between the body and soul. Big tears appeared in her eyes. Hard times will come to you some day, said the Viking woman, and it will be terrible for me as well. It might have been better if you had been set out on the road as a child, and the cold of night had lulled you to death. And the Viking woman wept bitter tears as she left, angry and sad, going behind the hide coverlet that hung from a beam to divide their room. Alone in the corner sat the shriveled frog. She didn't make a sound, but after a brief interval, a half-stifled sigh rose inside her, as if, in pain, a life were born deep inside her heart. She took a step forward, listened, took another step, and then grabbed with her clumsy hand at the heavy bolt on the door. Gently she slid it back. Quietly she pulled out the peg that had put in the latch. She grabbed the lighted lamp and stood in the front room. A strong will seemed to give her strength. She pulled the iron peg out of the locked trapdoor and crept down to the prisoner. He was asleep. She touched him with her cold, clammy hand. When he awoke, he saw the hideous creature. He shivered as if before an evil vision. She pulled out her knife, cut off his bonds, and beckoned him to follow her. He uttered sacred names, made the sign of the cross, and when the creature stood there unchanged, he said these words from the Bible. Blessed is he that is considereth the poor. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble. Who are you? How is it that you have the appearance of a beast, yet are filled with deeds of mercy? The frog creature beckoned and led him behind the tapestry dividers along the long passageway and out to the stables, where she pointed to a horse. He swung himself up onto its back. Then she climbed in front of him and held on to the animal's mane. The prisoner understood, and at fast trot they took the road that would have never found, heading for the open heath. He forgot about her hideous shape. He realized the Lord's grace and mercy at work through this monster. He said pious prayers and sang sacred songs. Then she began to tremble, as if the power of the prayers and songs were at work. Or is it the shiver of the cold in the morning that would soon arrive? What was it that she felt? She lifted herself high in the air, wanting to stop the horse and jump down, but the Christian priest held her tight with all his strength, loudly singing a hymn, as if it had the power to break the spell that held her in this hideous frog form. And the horse ran even more wildly. The sky turned red. The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, and with the clear flood of light came the transformation. She became the lovely young girl with the demonic, evil heart. The priest was holding the most beautiful young woman in his arms, and he was horrified. He leaped down from the horse and stopped the animal, believing that he was confronting another fiendish spell, but young Helga had leaped to the ground in the same instant. The short child's growth reached only to her knees. She tore the sharp knife from her belt and rushed at the astonished man. "Let me at you!" she cried. "Let me at you, and the knife will bury itself inside of you. You're as pale as straw. Thrall, beardless one!" She rushed at him, and as they fought a hard battle, but an invisible power seemed to give the Christian man strength. He held her tight, and the old oak tree nearby seemed to come to his aid by using its roots, half freed from the earth, to bind her feet, which had slipped underneath. Close by trickled a spring. He splashed the fresh water over her breast and face, asking the impure spirit to leave and blessing her in Christian fashion. But the waters of baptism have no power when the flood of faith does not stream from within. Yet in this he was also the stronger one. Yes, more than a man's strength against the warring evil power lay in his actions. It seemed to captivate her. She lowered her arms, looking with